So we're going to move on also with another experience of an individual that works with us that has had similar response capabilities down in the Virgin Islands. Summer Warfield currently works with the Spokane Regional Health District in the Public Health Preparedness and Response Program. Previously, she worked with the American Red Cross for a number of years. She still continues to be a disaster volunteer there, and she also had the pleasure of having an opportunity to serve in these responses. So she's going to share her experiences and lessons learned with us on what she was able to do.
Well, thank you. Can you guys hear me? Did I put that in the right spot? Okay. Aha, there I am. So I really appreciate getting to hear Nate's side of things. Nate and I experienced this much different ways. Because I was there with the Red Cross, I was definitely more involved directly in the community on a regular basis. We had some shared experiences as far as our involvement and what we were seeing. A lot of frustrations, fatigue. I'll show you a picture of my sleeping quarters. They may have been a little bit fancier than his. So this is down on St. Thomas. I left here the Wednesday after Irma went through. Initially, I didn't realize how bad it was because we started seeing reports from Florida. It didn't look to Florida. And I got a call from the Red Cross office, and they said, it's bad on the Virgin Islands. Do you want to go down? One of the reasons they contacted me 2 years ago, next month, I was down there for my honeymoon, fell in love with the islands, and I'd been plotting to get my husband to move down there after he gets out of the military. So I said, absolutely, I need to go down there. I need help. So when I flew out, I went to St. Croix first before I ended up at St. Thomas. And I was trying to figure out information about St. Thomas. About 4 miles by 2 miles in size, very small island. On that island, population of 50,000 people. The average median income is $43,000, but most of these families are extended families. It's just the culture on the island. So it's parents, it's multiple kids, it might be grandparents, aunts and uncles. So $43,000 in one home doesn't go very far. Most people there only have a high school education, and the primary revenue source is tourism. So when a hurricane comes through, destroys the airport, destroys the hotels, destroys all the entertainment venues, the tourists stop showing up. You saw some of the video and people on TV after that had gone through, crying and trying to get off the island because there was no resources. How do we get out of here? Finally, a cruise ship had shown up, a Mercy ship, and took all those tourists off the island. The British Virgin Islands had the same issue. So Irma hit on September 6th. It was a Category 5. It hit the island for about 2 hours, hovered over for a couple more hours at the eye, and then came back on the outer band and pummeled it for another 2 hours after that. Shortly after that, Maria came through on the 19th. Category 4-5, when it went through on St. Thomas, it did hit mainly the outer bands because it went over and took out St. Croix and Puerto Rico. Just kind of a visual, kind of where everything is. So you've got Cuba. Ooh, wrong way. Trying to figure out which button you use. Anyway, so St. Croix is kind of the big island. And then you've got St. Thomas over there that was primarily being supported after Irma from St. Croix and Puerto Rico right up above it. Because as Nate's saying, everything was being used up because of Harvey and Irma in Florida. That's where all the resources were. So they were getting help from Puerto Rico and St. Croix. So these are some before and afters. Obviously the top is before Irma had gone through. You look down here on the picture, you can just see how devastated it was. This green, lush, beautiful island, completely barren looking. Here's another before and after of the same area. This was, it was just terrorized, basically. A lot of the homes down there, the pressure from the winds and several tornadoes that came down actually blew out the walls while people were in them. They were tearing off the roofs. So you've got heavy winds and rain coming in, people trying to hold on to something to stay safe and not get flooded. All your belongings that you thought you were okay because you're in your home, now getting soaked and wet and wind coming through, debris coming through, washout from the hillside coming through, mud, rocks, name it, it was coming into the homes. So this is great. Nate was talking about everything that came in. So this top picture, this was in St. Croix, Puerto Rico. When I went through there, looked the exact same way. This was amazing to me. I'm like, oh my gosh, look at all this. This is great. All these resources are here. These militaries here, you know, yay, military. There's a helo. They're driving everything around. They're bringing everything we need. So this was a great feeling when I landed in St. Croix, which was kind of one of the hubs for trying to get resources. They were also evacuating some people as well and doing assessments. This bottom picture is a group of us getting ready to go over to St. Thomas. Going in there, we had FEMA, Marines, Air Force, federal agents, because there was issues on the island for security. The EPA was there. St. Croix was sending over law enforcement to relieve the law enforcement on St. Thomas because they were victims of the hurricane, but they also had jobs. Prison still runs, jail still runs. What do you do? They were exhausted. American Red Cross. Contracted law enforcement was there. We did have some fish and game. CDC was showing up to do an assessment. So we all got on a plane, fancy plane, thank you to the military and FEMA, and we went to St. Thomas. And this was their headquarters. We weren't able to use the headquarters because there was no power. There was no running water. We found a location that happened to have a generator, and a very kind gentleman who allowed us to use the space. He was very well known on the island, very giving older gentleman, never stopped, was the kindest man. Every time we'd see him and joke about, you know, did you bring me chocolate chip cookies? And we were truly trying to get some chocolate chip cookies down to the island for him. Unfortunately, about a week and a half into my time there, he had a heart attack and passed away because there was no medical really to be able to support it because it had been destroyed at the hospital. This was a common sight on the island. Keep in mind, it is 80 to 90 degrees all the time down there. It is damp, it is hot, and they weren't picking this stuff up. The smell radiated what was flooding out to the streets and into people's homes, same type of situation. Garbage wasn't being picked up because the roads were damaged, trucks were damaged, people couldn't get what they needed to help them. But this is people trying to recover. This is just after Irma at this point. These are some more areas. Infrastructure was devastated. One of the things I loved was the ingenuity of the people there on the island, getting 2x4s or whatever they could, propping up the wires enough so we could get cars underneath it and get around. That was just constant, and there was no power anywhere. Generators, if you had a generator or ice, you were king. Like, you could do no wrong on the island. So these are my sleeping quarters. We stayed in there was a private school there on the island. It had a gymnasium, and they allowed us to stay there. It had survived Irma. We tried to use the volleyball court and use that as a drying station. Nothing ever really dried. We did have some generators, so you see the string of lights that went through. And I have this picture up on the top. Two of those gentlemen are New York firefighters. They are part of a DART team, a disaster action response team, and they coordinate with the Red Cross, and they deploy to areas to try to help. They were the ones that were trying to find random resources for us. They're the ones that hooked up our generator. They were the ones that would run and get gas from the FEMA depot. They were the ones that would find out, talking to people on the island, where some needs were. We found out about an orphanage that had been neglected that needed our assistance. They were amazing. Another gentleman there with his arms crossed, he happened to be a contractor. What an amazing resource to have on the island when you're trying to figure out how to get water pressure so you can take somewhat of a shower. Even though if it's cold, still a shower. Hey, it'd be great if you could get running water in the toilets. Didn't happen. We used rainwater, put them in the tanks, flushed them. You went to the bathroom with that headlamp on. My first morning there, I was brushing my teeth, and I thought I felt something on my foot. I looked down. Nothing. Go to brush my teeth. I feel something run over my foot. I looked down. A cockroach had just run over my foot. And I stood there for a minute with the toothbrush, and I thought, this is the moment. This is the moment between I can't handle this, I'm going home, or I knew what I was getting myself into. I knew what I was getting myself into. I had a moment. Walked out, and I said, a cockroach just ran over my foot. A couple of guys just started laughing. They're like, only one? Good to know. A couple mornings later, I was woke up by a bunch of scuffle and chaos, and I'm like, what is going on? They were trying to capture a couple of tarantulas that were running underneath our cots and get them out of the area. I stayed on the cot, so I was like, that might be my limit right there, until they got rid of it. This was some of the structural damage that had happened. from Irma that we tried to stay away from, dampness issues. There was some minor tears around some of the windows where we were staying, but we were lucky. This was amazing what we got to sleep in compared to what everybody else was sleeping in. So Maria came through. I did have the option to leave. There was a FEMA evacuation flight. This was a tough one because you've got the human factor here. We were trying to work with the locals. They basically have PTSD from what they had just survived. They're looking for help, and we hear Maria's coming. So there's that anxiety. You can instantly feel it from all the local volunteers that were helping us. A lot of people in our group were very nervous about leaving, you know, or staying there. So a bunch of them took FEMA evacuation flights. It's fine, it's totally up to them. But then we realized FEMA's leaving, the Air Force is leaving, CDC, EPA, most of the federal agents, everybody's leaving. And there's this heavy hit because I got there on a Friday and they started leaving on Monday. So that picture I showed you where it was great, there was all these resources, those planes, they were all packing up and leaving. One of the DMATs that had finally show up to help turned around and packed up. We spent Tuesday morning watching these huge Air Force planes take off and fly over us. It is such a sinking and alone feeling. You feel very abandoned. This federal agency, that government that's supposed to be there to support you and help you and make this happen and all this recovery just took off and left. And all you can think is, we have nothing, we're alone, we're just sitting here, what are we gonna do? And it's very painful to watch it happen. There was a lot of crying from the locals because they felt abandoned because it took so long to get some of those resources there to really kind of start seeing the impact, and then to watch them leave was very hard on them. This picture I love because the school that we were at was the home of the hurricane. This was one of my volunteers, Maria, and this was the evening that Maria was coming through. So we stood outside and had to have a picture of Maria in the home of the hurricanes. She was a kick. She's from Puerto Rico. She drove like an islander. She was amazing to have, and she did actually end up turning around going to Puerto Rico about a month later where her family was and helped out there. Was happy to see that they were okay. And this is just some of the prepping inside. So as Maria is starting to happen, the local government says, we need to open evacuation shelters. We need all these people who are living in homes that are horribly damaged, a safe place to go. What structures do we have left that are functional? None. We don't have any functional. But the military has left us a couple of generators. So let's take this industrial generator and put it in a shelter where we can keep everybody safe, where we can keep some light on and make sure they're okay, because it survived Irma, so it'll survive Maria if it does the same thing. So this particular shelter was set up to be able to handle 500 people between 2 different rooms. We ended up housing 300 people there. I had another shelter that was particularly high needs shelter that I will go over here in a couple minutes. It was a tough one with a lot of flooding. We had issues with being able to take showers and so forth. I'll talk about that a little bit more. This was an amazing shelter just because of the pure size of it. That little girl in the corner was very upset because her mother wouldn't let her have a bag of Skittles, and she was very, very upset, and there was just not making her happy. Everybody there was eating MREs. The government had dropped off cases of MREs and snack packs. I'll show you a picture of those in a moment, and you'll see why that might be an issue. And what bottled water we have. The staff that I had there overnight were amazing. I showed up to relieve them. That's when I was there to start seeing some pictures. I sat down with the family at one point because they're very curious. I'm talking with them, and some people had left to go see how their home was and their friends and neighbors. And they're wanting to know, where are you from? What do you do? How long are you here? Wanting to know information about me and that I was a volunteer, that I'd come down without pay to help out. I wanted to be there. I was married. I had children, my loving cat that I had to leave, and I'd come down there to help them. And she leaned over and she touched me and she goes, thank you so much. We forget in the midst of all of our chaos what you've given up to come down here and volunteer. So that was my break point. So that talking about taking care of yourself, at this point I'm at about 6 days in, and it was been go, 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 lack of sleep. I know my routine. I usually break down about day 6 or 7. I have a moment and I recover and I go back into it. That was my break point. I thanked her, she hugged me. I went and found a corner, I had a washcloth, I sat in there and I bawled for about 10 minutes. Pulled myself together and thought, okay, I'm all right. I get to go home in a couple weeks. I had a 3-week deployment. They weren't gonna go home. This was some of the environment that people were having to stay in. This was a school, black mold. started up right away. All the schools had black mold. What schools had survived? Trees, obviously. And that was the government generator that we had problems with people siphoning gas because they needed it. There was a gas issue on the island. They had generators they were trying to maintain as well. Sorry about the finger in that photo. So these gentlemen are part of the Puerto Rican National Guard. They had been sent down post-Irma to help. They're in the process of cleaning out water that had flooded into the gymnasium where people were sleeping when Maria had come through. They were amazing. They knew Maria was heading to Puerto Rico, but they were there with us because they couldn't go home. They could have stopped, they could have shut down, they could have said no. They were an amazing help to us in this large area. Walked up to one gentleman and we were talking to the sergeant, a little bit older, and we started talking. Of course, they wanted to know about me. And I said, you know, have you been able to contact your family? He says, yeah, we had contact with them earlier, but we know we can't go back for a while. And he goes, but I'm not worried. I said, what? He goes, because you don't have to worry about our stuff. He goes, you know who the people that have to worry? It's the doctors, it's the lawyers, it's the people with the money that built fancy, beautiful homes. They used wood and things that aren't going to survive this. He goes, we're humble. We built our homes out of cement. He goes, I might not have power, but I will have a home when I go home. And I thought, all right then. Said nothing to say. He put his arms back behind and leaned back in his cot like, not a big deal. So I was just like, okay. So they were great. They tried to get a hold of their families after Maria went through. They had a hard time. There were a couple places on the island. If you stood just right at an angle, you could get cell service. And they ended up leaving 2 days after Maria had hit Puerto Rico to go back and help. So this is a snack pack. If you were diabetic, if you were elderly, if you're a child, if you have any nutritional needs, this is not going to sustain you. The local government handed this out all over the island. There was little to no insulin available to us on the island. I had people whose blood sugars were dropping overnight in the shelters who we were trying to get to the ER for what was left of an ER there to get help, and they would turn around and send them back with no extra insulin. Have you lived on an MRE? Has anybody ever had an MRE? Not the greatest thing. They're a little better than they used to be, but they're not great. Very hard to sustain somebody that has issues. So one of our shelters that we had, the one I was talking about, very high needs shelter, that top section, that was everything I had in about 25 people. That was my issues. We had the elderly, incontinence issues, diabetes, we had blind, mental health, dementia, everything that you see on there that we were trying to contain. Red Cross does not use, we are not a medical facility, it's just not what we do. But on this island, Red Cross wasn't in charge. Human Services owned the shelters and opened them, we were supporting them. So normally Red Cross would have sent these people to better locations, long-term care facilities, hospitals, but there was no long-term care facility. The hospital wasn't functional to an extent that they could take people, and we weren't in charge. But we stepped up and we did what we could to help these people out. I had volunteers who were nurses, paramedics, had done time in medical services of some sort, so we were trying to do as much as we could with as little as we had. Down below, we were helping out on the island with mental health issues. People didn't have their medications. You know, they started having problems. We had HIV and AIDS patients who had run out of their medications. Prior to Maria coming through, we moved kind of heaven and earth and had a military helo bring in medication from Puerto Rico for those people. Food and water supplies, cleaning supplies, and tarps, all those things were high needs down there on the island because everything had been damaged. We needed the help of the medical system, but the medical system wasn't functional to be able to help us. And the people that tended to work there that could have come and helped us were victims themselves. They were tired, they were exhausted, they were trying to save their own belongings and homes. These are some more pictures of the destruction. Like Nate was saying, things were just down all over the place. You just couldn't get around it to be able to function like you needed to. This ended up being my home away from home the last 4 days I was there. This is the SS Wright, is a decommissioned naval ship from the 70s. It was hotel, 5-star hotel. It was amazing to this point, but a lot of guilt because you're sitting on this at night looking out what should have been a beautiful island. It's black except for a couple of places where people clearly had generators. We had food, we had water, I could shower, I was able to wash my clothes for the first time in over 2 weeks. it was amazing, but there's a lot of guilt. So we intentionally would take extra food from the kitchen and give it to our local volunteers who were helping us. We would take extras, we wouldn't eat our breakfast, and we'd take it there so they could take it home because they didn't have power, they didn't have any way to sustain their food. There was limited resources on the island. Nothing was working to the fact that you could swipe a debit card, you had to have cash. Most of the ATMs were down, so you couldn't get cash to go into the places to get the food and belongings that you needed. It's a very tense environment for a lot of these people. And last I checked, they are finally at about 90% restored power on the island, but it's still going. The recovery there is extensive for what they're going to need. This is my final photo. This is kind of the last of us that stayed there. And on the island, they don't say goodbye. One of the cultural things, they say, I go to come back. This was my second time there, and I completely plan on going back. So absolutely, I left and I will be back.
Any questions?